And speaking of how senses evolved and how they help to survive, carrying on what Bernie said, the sense of smell, for example, can invoke very, very powerful memories of a place or a specific type of danger, an animal that may be around and that you want to escape from. But it does so in the most unique ways as compared to other senses. And I mean that in where if I'm sure we've all experienced this, where if you sense a specific type of smell from the past, it sometimes very vividly would flood your conscious thoughts with memories of a specific person or a place. Stuart, can you tell us about the biology of that? Why is the sense of smell so powerfully connected to memory, and how does it work?
Well, it's an excellent question, and I'm afraid it will stay a question even after my answer. so, so the best I can do is maybe sort of put some angles on the question a little bit. It would be interesting. It has been a puzzle in the field for a long time. We all have these experiences. In the field, we call it the Proust effect because it was famously written up by Marcel Proust in his massive book, Remembrance of Things Past, aptly titled, which starts off relatively early on, with this experience he has where he, 40 some odd years old, has a cup of lemon tea and a Madeleine biscuit, and it evokes this memory suddenly, this vivid memory of when he was a child, because after church every Sunday, he would be served lemon tea and Madeleine cookies by his aunt. And this is what really motivates the entire rest of the book. I mean, hundreds of thousands of words of remembrance of things past. And he's struck by this vivid memory. It's a beautiful passage, by the way, in its description of memory and how memory might work well, it's not a fictional sense. It's a personal recounting of it. But it's beautiful. He talks about how it's there and then it fades. And then he has to wait a while, but he can re-evoke it, but it's not always as strong the next time, and it's not controllable, but it's so vivid, it's so present. How could that be from 40 years ago when he hadn't thought about this for 40, literally had never thought about it, and bingo, there it was as if it happened an hour ago. So here's what I can tell you a little bit about that. One is that these kinds of memories, these kinds of olfactory memories that are so vivid and evocative, are always emotional memories. So you don't smell something and remember a phone number or an equation or a page of text or something really useful like that. These memories are always of some childhood event, a first lover, your grandmother's living room or basement or something like that, the first day of school, Crayola crayons, I don't know, all of these sorts of things. They're always memories that are tied to emotion. That may have something to do with the wiring of the olfactory system. And Bernie, we could get into this in some depth maybe a little bit later on. One of the curious things about the olfactory system is that unlike all the other sensory systems, it does not go through thalamic nuclei. There's no direct connection between the olfactory system and the thalamus, which is, all other sensory systems go from the primary receptors. Usually their first relay is in the thalamus and some thalamic nuclei, and then they're sent out in various ways that we don't entirely understand to cortical tissue. In olfaction, that doesn't happen. And so there are, on the other hand, direct connections to the amygdala and to other areas of the limbic system, which tend to, of course, be associated with emotional regulation. And so that may be one reason why these olfactory recalls, are so vividly emotional. I mean, I'm waving my hands around here, right? You can't see that, but I'm waving my hands around.
I can see it. I like waving hands, actually.
Okay, good. You can certainly feel the breeze going by, I'm sure.
Sure.
So the answer is we don't really know. There are all sorts of interesting examples of it. People test it a lot, but it's hard to know whether it's true in other animals as well. Now, I mean, there are long-term olfactory memories. One of the most interesting uses of it was by a fellow named John Garcia many years ago. Where was he? Somewhere in Colorado, Utah, somewhere out there, sort of not quite the coastal West. And one of the places it shows up is in this thing we call a taste aversion. So we'll talk in a moment, I guess, about the difference between taste and smell. But a lot of what we call taste is really flavor, and a lot of that is really olfactory. So when you talk about a taste aversion, it's often really an olfactory aversion. or it's wound up with an olfactory aversion, and it's wound up with an olfactory memory. So you know the situation. It's a very similar situation where you eat something, it's bad, it makes you sick, and now you can't stand to be near that ever again. You just never want to taste it again. So it's a very long-lasting kind of memory. It's one trial memory. There are all kinds of curious things about it. It's related to this olfactory memory business. So John Garcia used it in the following interesting way, I think. This was a problem with sheep farmers somewhere out, as I say, in the West, and predation by coyotes on the sheep. And the sheep farmers wanted to trap and kill all the coyotes, which would have in the end been something of an environmental disaster. And what Garcia did was he took some sheep, some dead sheep, and he laced them with a chemical called lithium chloride. The lithium chloride is itself actually odorless and tasteless, but if you eat it, you will get deathly ill. You won't die from it, but you will get quite sick from lithium chloride. And so he laced these sheep carcasses with lithium chloride and spread them all around the fields. And these coyotes came and ate them and then got deathly ill. And that was it. They would never go near another sheep. Couldn't stand the smell of sheep. They had now, associated the smell of sheep with being terribly ill. And that was it. And it was actually a very effective method of reducing coyote predation on sheep without killing the coyotes. So that's one crazy application of this sort of thing. But again, we don't really understand how it happens. It's very curious, these taste aversions. One trial learning, the actual event, the eating, the thing you eat, and when it makes you sick can be separated by many hours, which is typically not the case for learning, as you probably well know, that usually you have to associate things fairly closely. So where in the global workspace we hold this memory, Bernie, I think is a very interesting thing to ask. I mean, how do we know that 6 hours ago what I ate is what made me sick?
Oh, absolutely. Pavlov's experiments typically used a 3-second interval between the bell and the food, which is the conditioned and the unconditioned stimulus. And from 3 seconds in dogs with totally arbitrary stimuli, right? Because there are no dinner bells in nature, right? Not even food powder and not even meat powder. And suddenly you go from 3 seconds to 24 hours with the wolves. And it's astonishing. I think Garcia's work certainly convinced me that associative conditioning, even with relatively arbitrary stimuli, that it can be extremely powerful, but you have to work with nature, right, rather than against nature.
Yes. So we don't know what the mechanisms for this are. To just kind of finalize the answer with a bigger question, but it remains an active area of research. We certainly would like to know. This, to some extent, Bernie, brings us to an interesting issue with the way the olfactory system is wired, since, as I mentioned, there's no thalamic nuclei. The olfactory circuit, the brain circuit in olfaction, is very, I guess what you'd call very shallow. There are, Ramon Cajal, famously, the famous neuroanatomist, maybe the father of modern neuroscience, was the first to recognize that there are only 2 synapses between the outside world and olfactory cortex. You were talking briefly a minute ago about visual cortex, but to get from your photoreceptors that actually detect photons to IT or the medial temporal lobe, there's several synapses, 6 or 7 synapses. There are 3 or 4 just in the retina, let alone getting further back to the cortex. But in the olfactory system, you have your olfactory receptor neurons that send their axons or cables to the olfactory bulb, where they make a synapse with a second order neuron called a mitral cell, and that mitral cell sends its axon to the piriform cortex, where it makes a synapse with pyramidal cells in cortex. And that's it.